Award-winning Scottish science fiction author Ken MacLeod joins the Plutopia podcast this time. His writings address the failures of modern political systems, the rise of nationalism, the search for common interest in a fragmented world. Ken is working on his 20th novel and admits the writing process is not easy.
By far and away the hardest thing for me to do is plot. Getting a general idea of the story, getting a world, an imaginary world, getting ideas. That's easy, that's the first stage. The thing I sweat and swear and stumble over repeatedly is plot. And most of the mental effort of writing goes into that. At the moment I'm writing my 20th novel, and it hasn't got any easier. I've got a couple of chapters, maybe 2 or 3 chapters left to write. I've just reread everything I wrote so far in the novel, and it's not quite as bad as I thought. You get very critical of your work if you've read it several times over.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Plutopia News Network. I'm John Lebkowski, and I am joined by co-hosts Scoop Sweeney and Wendy Grossman. And today our guest is the great author Ken MacLeod, author of 19 science fiction novels, 4 novellas, over 30 short stories, and a few poems. His work has been widely translated and ranges from near-future dystopia to far-flung space opera, drawing on his first-hand knowledge of biological science, information technology, and political activism. An experienced speaker, event chair, and organizer, he's given talks, workshops, and readings at public events, libraries, universities, and schools, and he's joining us today to talk to the Plutopians. Hey, Ken, how are you doing?
Very well, thanks, and thank you for having me, and thanks for the kind words.
Well, we're so glad you could join us today. I have a first question here, which I'm just kind of wondering how, and this is probably, we had Adam Roberts here the other day, and we were talking about his history of fantasy. And one thing, I think we kind of talked about the definition of science fiction, but just briefly, how do you define science fiction? And to what extent does science fiction, in your mind, incorporate fantasy, if at all?
I think science fiction is fiction of an imaginary world that maybe in the future or in a different timeline or even the past. But I think the key distinction between science fiction and fantasy is that in science fiction, minds run on top of material processes, whereas in fantasy, the world runs on top of essentially mental processes. So in a fantasy, spells can work, prophecies can come true, and so on. Less so, except coincidentally, in science fiction. And of course, you can merge the genres. You can apply rigorous thinking to fantasy. And you can expand the scope of physical law in science fiction. And yeah, that's about it. I've written, I think, one fantasy novella, but it's kind of rationalized fantasy. So yeah, there are overlaps, but by and large, I think fantasy exists in a world where idealism is true, and science fiction in a world where materialism is true at some level.
And some science fiction is referred to as hard science fiction. What's the difference between hard science fiction and other kinds of science fiction?
Hard science fiction tends to be about, or to be written by people who are trying to keep the physics as much within known physics as possible and as believable as possible, and to rationalize the departures from it, like with FTL and so forth. Now, to be honest, although some people have said that I write hard science fiction, I don't think I do. I try to get the numbers right, at least in my notes, and I try to not deviate from known physics where we're dealing with the known world. But I'm fairly cavalier about the rationalizations of things like FTL, for example, in the cases where I have used it, which isn't a lot, come to think of it.
What's your process for conceiving worlds that are different from the worlds that we normally, well, this world?
I think basically it's reading a lot and making a lot of notes. I have stacks of notebooks where I scribble down ideas. I mean, I always carry a notebook, a very, very portable notebook in my back pocket or a jacket pocket if I'm not wearing jeans. This is an even thinner notebook than that. And yeah, I scribble down notes, and sometimes they're an idea for a story. Sometimes it becomes a detail or a character or something, or even a name. And somehow out of all of that, an idea will come.
You've written a lot of what people refer to as space opera, fiction that takes place in outer space. And I've been wondering, especially recently, hearing about how difficult it is for some people who spend a lot of time in space and so forth. I'm wondering if you believe that space travel in the way that we often see it represented in science fiction is actually ever going to be a thing, that it's really possible that humans will ultimately be able to live in space kind of the way they'd have to make sort of like long distance travel, faster than light travel, FTL, as you said.
I suppose the honest answer is probably not. The conceptions of space habitats, as far as I know, were, whether they're financially feasible is one thing, but they seem to be technologically feasible in engineering terms. And with a spinning space habitat, you could overcome, obviously, the microgravity problem and everything that comes out of that with regard to bone mass, muscle tone, circulation, etc. But I'm increasingly of the opinion that, at least until we get some breakthrough technologies which we can't possibly count on, I think that space travel will remain kind of at the level of Antarctic exploration for a very long time to come. And, you could have a Mars colony or settlement, you could have a moon base, but I think they'd be temporary and heavily dependent on Earth. And unfortunately, the sort of Heinlein, Larry Niven, Jerry Purnell type solar system that I certainly enjoyed reading about and imagining when I was much younger, is unlikely to be our real future.
I was reading an analysis of Elon Musk's desire to go to Mars, I think. And they were sort of saying that, living there is not really a possibility. I think one of the things they said was the dust on Mars is poisonous. I don't know if it's true. It's not my area, but I thought the analysis seemed pretty persuasive that like many of Musk's dreams, it's unlikely to come true.
Yeah, I think that's so. I think there's an enormous case for sending humans to Mars for exploration, because humans can still do things that robots still can't. And certainly the robots that we can feasibly send to Mars in the next decades are not as can't do all the things human beings can do. I've often wished that, whenever the rover turns over an interesting rock or trundles very slowly up an interesting ridge, I occasionally think, someone in a spacesuit with a geologist's hammer could make short work of all this. So that kind of thing, I think, is feasible. But, colonization, I mentioned Antarctica. We have had scientific sites and bases on Antarctica for well over a century now, I think, or up to a century. And yet nobody is seriously thinking of colonizing Antarctica. And Antarctica is probably literally 1 million times more hospitable than Mars.
I was going to say it's a lot closer.
It's a lot closer and it's a lot more survivable.
Well, in researching your past history online, on your Wikipedia entry, you're referred to as a techno-utopianist, and I was fascinated. What is a techno-utopianist?
I think the last time I looked, it said techno-utopian socialist.
No, it says libertarian socialist, which I find really fascinating because the libertarians we all think of are terribly right-wing.
Yeah, most of them I know are terrible right-wing too. That's a complicated question. By techno-utopian, I think they mean that I'm fairly confident that the use of technology, automation, and cheap energy and so on can greatly improve the human condition. And by a libertarian socialist, I do think that in the long run, some kind of common planning is probably the way we'll have to go, especially because more or less, as some well-known socialist economists have predicted, the concentration of wealth at the top and the scale of corporations and so forth has become so vast that planning becomes both necessary and feasible. However, that's a big question. The libertarian angle is mainly, I do think markets will remain necessary for a very long time until we get some Star Trek-y type automation or whatever, and that generally in favor of all kinds of personal freedoms.
Yeah, the utopian part, I have to point out that our company name, Plutopia, is a portmanteau of pluralist utopias. So it has a nice ring to it, I guess, but I'm not sure if we're going to ever find any pluralist utopias in the current age.
Well, no, I like the idea, and it reminds me of a book I read many, many years ago now by Robert Nozick, his famous Anarchy, State and Utopia, which, whatever else may be said about it, does make one think. And Nozick eventually comes down to, well, utopia is simply the free market and people can develop different ways of life within it. But I don't think that's really a utopia. I think people, but one of the strong points he made is that people are very diverse. And just even the people you know, unless you're a very unfortunate person, the people you know are very varied indeed. And so imagining a utopia that would work for everyone is probably not very likely. And most utopias, it has to be said, are deeply repellent. The only utopia that I know of, quite honestly, the only utopia that I know of that most people who read it would like to live in it if it was possible is the civilization invented by my late friend Ian M. Banks.
You know, when I hear the word techno-utopian, I mean, I assume what that means is that technology will solve all of our problems. And from what I know of your writing, I don't think that's a message that you convey, is it?
No, it's certainly not. Maybe I should get someone to edit that Wikipedia article.
Maybe I'll change it for you.
Uh,
I don't know. Well, I kind of getting back to you were talking about like robots on Mars and that sort of thing. And I know that it's a common science fiction trope to use robots in various contexts, especially in space. And I know that you've had AIs in space in your novels. Um, the thing that has struck me about that recently, I mean, in talking about our current use of AI, there's a lot of concern about the the power required to power AIs. And I think that one of the things that is a little bit unrealistic in a lot of science fiction is that you have robots who don't seem to have a clear power source, you know? How it seems that robots would be very limited in what they could actually achieve unless we found some so far unknown power source.
I think that's probably true. I mean, most of the robots in the world, by far the most of the robots in the world today are simply industrial arms in factories. And I think the question about the power use of AI, what we currently call AI is large language models. And large language models use, ridiculous amounts of power to get very trivial or socially damaging results. And I hope that the current large language model version of the AI development goes bust in the not too distant future, because it's a complete distraction. It's not like it's doing a lot of damage to the livelihoods of writers. And I don't mean all creative writers so much as people like copywriters and filler writers and journalists and so on, reporters. And it's doing a lot of damage to artists, because anybody can create a quasi-realistic image for an advertisement, and you see them all over the place, especially online. Even from quite respectable companies, you can tell they're using AI to generate images and even moving images. And I think all of that may be a useful application sometimes, but I don't think it's anything like the kind of artificial intelligence that we imagined in science fiction. I think that a true artificial intelligence would have to be capable of reasoning and of making its way around in the world semi-autonomously and learning new stuff as it went along. So I would say that even though it has a much smaller brain, the robots trundling about on Mars are closer to an artificial intelligence than the ones that are currently gulping power and water at an alarming pace.
Well, the problem with this sort of AI is the good enough thing, isn't it? That for a lot of purposes you don't. I remember when you used to get a photographer into the computer magazine's office to literally photograph the computer screen so that you could have a screenshot in an article. And of course that soon gave way to screen capture software that just sits on your computer, and then all the freelance writers were required to produce the screenshots for free. And the problem is they were good enough for the purpose. And, I think a lot of the kinds of AI images that you're talking about, again, are, I can't draw at all. And I can sort of, if I have a camera that is able to focus for me and things like, and improve lighting for me and stuff, I can take passable pictures. They're not going to be as good as a photographer's pictures, but for a lot of purposes, they'll be good enough. And I think there's a lot of parts of life where we've settled for good enough, and the internet has brought a lot of that too. No, there is no internet service provider who offers the kind of service level agreement you used to get from the phone company, for example.
Mm.
But we've decided that's good enough.
That makes me think about our podcast here. Specifically, the videos that we use are, we have varying bandwidth, and the final video usually has less than highest quality, uh, imaging. Uh, but it's fine for what we're doing, and we're really focused on the conversation and not so much on the visible images. But that is an effect of the internet. I think that the internet has taught us to put up with things that are less than perfect,
Not just the
especially
internet, though.
service.
I remember when the first time I saw somebody show up with a portable music player and said, "Look at this." It was an 8-track player, and look at this really great thing. I can carry music around. Well, an MP3 on a player, I don't care how good the player is never going to be as great as live music or as the old the the fancy high end stereo systems in people's homes. But it's good enough, and it means you can carry it around and listen to it in places where you couldn't listen to it before.
Yeah, but are you saying that the same could be true of AI images and AI text?
For some applications, yes. Sadly. I mean, you know, would I rather read a human report of the quarterly earnings of some company? Absolutely, because they've probably brought some more knowledge and intelligence and wit to it. But if all you want is the numbers and stuff and a fast report, I can see why some of those things start to get AI generated.
Yeah, yeah.
I think the jury's out on a lot of this stuff, as far as to what extent people will actually accept it. And I'm waiting to see someone publish a novel that was written by an AI. My guess is that it won't be particularly readable or compelling.
You don't have to wait. Amazon is filling up with novels written by AI, or at least
Oh,
with a massive AI assistance.
Right, and
And
Spotify's playlists are full of AI generated tracks too.
are they? I thought that Spotify um, made a policy that they weren't going to allow AI tracks, and that one initial ban that was so widely refuted, I guess, by music lovers, that they removed all of their tracks.
Fortunately, I'm on the trad folk end, and there isn't anybody who's daft enough to spend money having an AI create something that sounds like traditional folk because there's no money in it, as any folk singer can tell them.
A lot of
So,
the argument for AI tracks was always we don't have to pay any royalties to anyone. The AI doesn't have an agent. But one of the things with AI is they've been used to create programming. And Ken, you were a programmer at one time. Would you trust an AI programmer?
well, it's a long time since I've been a programmer, and I think having remembering all the time, all the amount of rather tedious code that I had to write, I think I would trust it to generate code, but it'd still have to be. I would still have to check it very carefully, and that's part of the reason why the productivity gain is not as much as was expected, because you need humans to check it.
Did you
yeah,
see this? Did you see the story about the policeman in Utah who apparently had signed off on a summary of somebody's investigation of something, and in the middle of this thing, there was this line about the police officer turning into a frog, and and a magic book appeared, and it turned out that it was the story behind it was something like the body cam the police officer was wearing picked up a Harry Potter movie playing on the television in the background. And, but it's interesting that there are several, the article I read about it went on to say that a number of police departments in Utah are trialing AI summarizing software. And at least one of these different types of software has a setting where you can instruct it to insert errors deliberately to make as a test to make sure that the police are actually reading it carefully and checking it over before they submit it, which I thought was interesting. But it also turns out that one of the places that was using that found that if they kept the setting off, they saved a lot of time. But if they turned the setting on, the time savings kind of disappeared.
That makes sense.
I want to kind of go back to when you started writing fiction. This is something I'm often curious about, but I also know that you bring political thinking to some extent into your fiction, and I'm wondering, kind of, why did you start writing fiction, and was any of your motivation involved with exploring how political ideas might play out?
Yeah, well, in a way, I like a lot of science fiction writers, I started off as a science fiction reader, and like a lot of readers, I started very young in my early teens. And I think, again, like a lot of early teen readers, it started giving me ideas for stories of my own. And that got me through quite a few English language compositions in my school days, because I could write a science fiction short story at short notice for my essay question. And a bit later than that, I would have started sending stories to, initially I sent one to New Worlds. So I got my very first rejection slip from Hilary Bailey, then the editor of New Worlds, for a complete shaggy dog story of the kind that editors were rejecting in the 1930s. But I never really had an ambition to be a science fiction writer as such to begin with. The result of reading all that science fiction was that I had an ambition to be a scientist, which I took as far as I could, which didn't get me quite as far as a PhD. It got me an MPhil. And like a lot of failed scientists in the 1980s, or unemployed science graduates in the 1980s, I became a programmer after a few years of temporary jobs of one kind or another, and I worked in IT. And I kept having ideas for novels and science fiction stories, and I kept talking about them to my friend Ian Banks, who went to the same secondary school as I did and went to a different university, and we met up again in London. And Ian got his first novel published, I think, when he was 30. The Wasp Factory, and he continued writing science fiction. He started writing. Ian, to backtrack a little bit, Ian was always determined to be a science fiction writer, and he was writing from his student days, in fact, his late school days onwards, and he wrote what became the culture novels. He wrote several of them before anything got published, and it was when The Player of Games got turned down, his first draft of The Player of Games was turned down, that he decided, as he rather sheepishly said to some of his friends, that he had decided to go mainstream. He hoped we didn't blame him for it, and we assured him we didn't. And he wrote this nice mainstream middle of the road novel, The Wasp Factory, which launched him on his career. And I think at the launch party of one of his novels, I was taken aside by a mutual friend who told me that Ian was getting a bit tired of hearing about the novels I was going to write. So I decided to prove to myself and to Ian that I could at least write a novel. And I had finished my MPhil thesis and got my degree from that. I was working as a programmer. And so I launched into this novel, which I'd had in the back of my head for a very long time. In fact, I had the title before I had the idea for the novel. The title was The Star Fraction. And around the time I started writing, it was late 1980s. And by the time I finished it was early 90s. And this was at the time when the communist ruled countries in Russia and Eastern Europe had gone into crisis and the socialist systems had fallen. And I had been a very committed socialist activist in various areas, and I had been interested in the critiques of socialism as well, because I took them seriously, including the libertarian free market critique, the conservative critique, the democratic or social democratic critique, and so on. And with all of this thought world of the left, if you like, collapsing around me, it seemed a very interesting thing to do, to explore some of these ideas in fictional form. And I guess I did that in my first 4 novels, which got called the Fall Revolution books.
Yeah, I noticed that you created a interesting socialist group, the Webblies, and that reminded me of my time living in Berkeley. I encountered some of the latter-day Wobblies. Was that a bit of the inspiration, the old wobbly union groups?
Oh, absolutely, yes. It was a homage to the IWW. I just thought it was very funny having this even longer name, the IWWWW, International Workers of the World Wide Web. I think Cory Doctorow borrowed that term for one of his novels. He was delighted with it.
I think, didn't they get Rapture of the Nerds from you too?
No, this is one of these long-standing misunderstandings that I should have an FAQ about, actually. And I got the term the Rapture of the Nerds, or perhaps it was originally the Rapture for Nerds, from a magazine that came out in the early 90s called Extrophy. And I
remember that mag.
Yeah. You can still find PDFs of it online. And I'm actually still exploiting ideas that I first found in these issues of Extrophy.
I used to hang out with extropians, actually.
Yeah, the extropians.
Yeah.
The extropians became the model for I suppose, the bad guys in my second novel, Stone Canal.
I can imagine that.
Yeah. The extropians email list was a
Well, in the current situation in this country, socialism has gotten a big boost, at least through Senator Sanders, the Democratic Socialist. And do you think that is just a one-off thing, or that maybe there is hope for some socialism in this country and others?
Yeah, I don't think it's a one-off. Things like the way that the Democratic Socialists of America expanded as a result of the Sanders campaign, and people like Mamdani in New York campaigning as a socialist, albeit a very reformist socialist, indicate a continuing interest in socialist ideas. And America has a very rich socialist tradition that most Americans don't know about. And there's a lot of stuff in old books and so on that some of which are now online that could be explored. Great public speakers and agitators like Debs, and many more in different traditions. So yeah, there's
Woody Guthrie, presumably.
Pardon?
Woody Guthrie too, presumably.
Yeah. So
He had a sticker on his guitar that said, "This machine kills fascists."
Yes, good for him. So yeah, there was this fairly widespread, very contested, but still popular socialist tradition in America got completely clobbered in the late 1940s, early 1950s by both McCarthyism and the post-war boom and the Cold War. So something could come out of that.
Yeah, there are actually wobblies still in organizing in this country. They've been going after coffee shops like Starbucks and that like, and having limited success, but at least they're still trying.
Oh yeah, and there are wobblies in this country too, although there are very few of them. But the ones that I have met have been young and enthusiastic, and union, kind of smallish autonomous unions inspired by that kind of tradition, who might not necessarily call themselves wobblies or IWW, have emerged in areas of precarious work among, delivery cyclists and so on, delivery drivers, coffee shops here too, getting organized and so on. It's a long struggle.
Yeah, I've been thinking about like gig workers. Gig workers are, I think, supposedly hard to organize, but it seems like they would be organizing like crazy, And I'm thinking about like Uber drivers and DoorDash people and that sort of thing. I'm a little surprised that they haven't organized effectively so
They've
far.
done some things. I know there was a lawsuit in Britain, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And I think in some of the European countries, they've banded together to force Uber to treat them as, to give them workers' rights, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Well, so getting back to your writing, what do you find really difficult in writing novels? What's the hardest thing for you to do?
By far and away, the hardest thing for me to do is plot. Getting a general idea of a story, getting an imaginary world, getting ideas, that's easy. That's the first stage. The thing I sweat and swear and stumble over repeatedly is plot. And most of the mental effort of writing goes into that. At the moment, I'm writing my 20th novel, and it hasn't got any easier. I've got a couple of chapters, maybe 2 or 3 chapters left to write. I've just reread everything I wrote so far in the novel, and it's not quite as bad as I thought. You get very critical of your work if you've read it several times over, and just bringing it all into a satisfactory conclusion is, and making sure everything holds together. That's the hard part. Some people don't find that, but not every writer finds that by any means. But I do.
Well, you've
And
read
some.
you. Well, I was just
No,
going to
go
say
on.
in trilogies, and I often wondered this: when you write the first book of a trilogy, do you know it's going to be a trilogy? Do you have the whole thing planned?
I usually know it's going to be a trilogy. Yes, because I've got a contract I'd have had a contract for a trilogy, and I do have a general outline of the second and third books when I start on the first. but these outlines often have very little relationship to what eventually happens in book 3.
Does a story kind of take a life of its own that causes you to maybe have to go back and change things because it went in an unexpected direction?
Sometimes this happens. But I try not to let it happen too much. The most recent trilogy, starting with Beyond the Reach. Oh, that's the first one. Beyond the Hallowed Sky, Beyond the Reach of Earth, and Beyond the Light Horizon. Yes, the story changed in the telling. These things do happen. Now, it's not like this for everybody. Again, like the difficulty with plot. Ian Banks, for example, could outline his whole plot in his head, more or less, and he had everything nailed down, more or less to the paragraph level, before he started writing. I've tried to do that, and I can't. To take another example from another friend of mine, Charles Stross, he writes and rewrites. He has an idea for a story, a novel, could be a series even. He'll just get the ideas in his head and then start writing. And he does a lot of rewriting and reworking. And I do a lot of planning and preparation, but he actually writes faster than I do. So his output of novels is greater than mine. So it's horses for courses,
Well, Charlie Strauss's wife once published a hilarious posting on Live Journal detailing the life of the writer's wife, and from the sounds of it, he doesn't do anything except write and brood. It was really funny.
Well, I can assure that Charlie does a lot more than just write and brood.
No, I know that. But I mean, I guess with it, when you're doing a trilogy, you have to be careful that the story doesn't stray too far from what you had in mind, or the second novel, you'll have to go back and rewrite the first novel after it's been published.
Well, you can't do that.
No, exactly. Yeah.
And
I was just thinking about how, I write, most of my writing has been nonfiction. I've written almost no fiction as an adult anyway. And I can't tell you how many times my last paragraph has become my first paragraph. It was just a thing, and I mean, I always have an idea of what I'm writing, but I guess the last thing that I write usually feels right for the first paragraph or second paragraph, something like that.
Do you think it takes you the process of writing the whole thing in order to figure out what you're writing about?
I think that's probably kind of it. And I've wondered to what extent people, I mean, I've also had to go back and change things because structurally the thing I'm writing has changed, or the way I'm thinking about it has changed. And I think I would be, if I was writing novels, I would be one who would do a lot of rewriting, for sure.
I do a lot of trimming. I write a 850 word piece every week, and it's usually like 12 or 1300 words by the time I feel like I've got everything put in it, and then I start chipping away all the things that are not that week's net worth, basically. Or I've learned to notice like all the places where 2 words would take the place of 8, things like that.
I think in fiction, the thing that would be hardest for me, and I'd like to know what you think about this, Ken, is in creating characters and making characters that really feel real,
well, one does one's best. What Wendy was saying though, about line editing is a tremendously important skill for writing fiction. And I generally, if I write, it's a good day if I write 1,000 words, and it's a good morning the following morning if I've got that 1,000 words down to 900. And then I write another 1,000 words and get them down to 900, and so on.
I once saw the original manuscript for Finnegan's Wake, and it was a mess. They were making all their corrections on the, on the manuscript.
I remember reading that Douglas Adams, faced with a deadline, could take the 5 pages he had, and after several days of furious writing, reduce them to 2.
Yes, don't.
Well, do you have a collection of ideas that really stuck with you? I had a writer friend who had a file card box, and he called it the chicken and the egg box. And it's from the old, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And there were a lot of eggs that he would identify as just great ideas, but he could never work them into becoming the chicken, to becoming the book or the article that he wanted to write. Do you have a collection of those great ideas that you haven't been able to find a home for?
Well, I have an enormous pile of notebooks. I was just turning aside there to look at the little file drawer that has, that's just one lot of old notebooks. And if I'm bereft of ideas, I can always look through them for ones that have got lost. And that is, occasionally it happens for novels, more often for short stories. And there have been times when I have started a short story and not got anywhere with it and just put it aside. And then something else has come up, like quite often some editor wants a short story from me, and I look through my ideas and sometimes my unfinished stories, and I find one that actually I now know how to finish. Usually I find with short stories, the trick is you need 2 ideas. 2 ideas that can intertwine like a double helix, and then they can start replicating. It's quite, that's how it works for me anyway. I can write down an idea and then I find another idea.
Have you ever written or started a short story that grew into a novel?
Yeah, I have actually. It was one of these commissioned short stories way back in the early 90s, or way back in the late 90s it would be. Computer Weekly, which is a regular newspaper in the United Kingdom, asked me to write a short story about a science fiction story about the world of computers 50 years hence. And I wrote a story called Resident Alien, which involved a lot of old programmers based on me and my friends, as you know, as I imagined us as we might be in the 2020s, who get hauled out of retirement every so often to work on legacy systems. And that got combined with the story of alien first contact. So you see how ideas go together. And that actually became the second chapter, I think, of my first Engines of Light book, Cosmonaut Keep. So in that case, the short story did grow into a novel. Sometimes it works the other way around. A novel will have some stray ideas or ideas that are undeveloped in it, and I will put them into a short story.
If you need two ideas for a short story, how many ideas do you need for a novel?
Good question. I think lots and lots. The latest trilogy, for instance, it came out of some of these processes. Like, I had to come up with some ideas to pitch to my editor and publisher for my next novels. And I was rummaging through very old notebooks going back to my student days, actually. And in them, I'd had this idea of a near future FTL, faster than light travel. I thought, there's an interesting idea. I wonder if I could do something with that now. And I started thinking about how that might happen. And also being when I wrote these ideas down in my teens or early 20s, they were full of fervent images of the revolution. And I suppose these were the two ideas. And I thought, yeah, I'll put that in as well and have this all happening in my own area, in my local area in Inverclyde. And that's how that came together. It doesn't, my joke about these novels is that it's the first space opera set in Guruk, which is of course not true, but it has Guruk as a setting for, and the nearby towns as a setting for some of the events. And the revolution that's imagined is somewhat less scary than the one I was looking forward to in the 1970s.
And this is the Lightspeed trilogy?
Yes, yeah.
I thought it was interesting that you had them hiding, like discovering faster than light travel and then keeping that hidden for, what was it, 50 years or something like that?
Yeah.
Seems like that would leak.
You'd think it would, yes.
But wasn't that also like, I guess I was reading a lot of science fiction in the early 70s, and stories set in space were very common. But then there was a period, wasn't there, where they sort of disappeared in favor of cyberpunk and sort of more computery things. Doesn't it seem like, I don't know, maybe my perception is wrong. But it seemed like space travel went away for a while as a subject, as a setting.
It certainly went away from the cutting edge of science fiction, that's true. And there were stories set in space in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the 90s, but the big thing that happened after cyberpunk was what became called the new space opera. And one thing that helped kick it off, I think, is Ian Banks's books. Consider Phlebas came out in the 90s, and Colin Greenland had written a bizarre space opera set in a science fictional solar system.
It's Take Back Plenty, wasn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, thoroughly enjoyable.
I used to see a lot of Colin when he was living in London.
Yeah, a really nice guy.
Yeah, lovely.
And then, people like Stephen Baxter and Paul Macaulay, and a bit later, Justina Robson. Pardon?
I'm sorry. A lot of new science fiction is considered dystopian fiction, the end of the world kind of thing. Do you think that kind of relates to what is actually happening in the world, and it's seeping over into science fiction.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Yeah. There's a lot of dystopian science fiction around, and dystopia has become almost a respectable term to
And
pass off your science fiction as mainstream literature,
and unfortunately, as they keep saying on social media, the tech companies are taking these stories as instruction manuals instead of cautionary tales.
Well, yes, the torment nexus question, yes. Yeah, the only dystopia, if you like, that I've written is called Intrusion. And it's about a very, a dystopia that for many people would seem quite okay to live in, of a high surveillance society with lots of interventions for your own good on the population.
There was kind of
So yeah, it's the only one of my novels that seems to have actually got referred to in some political debate among members of Parliament, not in Parliament, I hasten to add, but in some debate, and got some people thinking.
There was an interesting thing a few years ago. There was there have been ongoing Star Trek revivals over the years, and one was with the creation of a new series called Star Trek Discovery. And its initial couple of seasons were kind of dark and dystopian. And I think people were sort of rejecting that. It didn't fit people's thinking about Star Trek as being a more sort of positive and hopeful view of the future. And all the Star Trek stuff since then has been sort of carrying the vibe of the original series more, you know? Um, and I guess what I'm saying is that I think dystopia may be a hard sell when you're actually living in a fairly dystopian time because people want to be they want to be uplifted. They don't want to be reminded.
Well, yes, this is true, and I think that it's a good time to write hopeful science fiction, partly because of a way of suggesting ways out of the situation we're in.
Which we hope there are.
Well, indeed, yes.
Yeah, I would hope not to read a science fiction novel about a despotic president. I've had enough of that already.
Yeah.
A loony despotic president.
Don't. You can't go on writing it can't happen here when it has happened here,
The interesting thing about science fiction to me is that people have learned to accept ideas that they might otherwise think are absurd. I mean, faster than light travel is one. I mean, anybody who's watched Star Trek at warp speed is kind of comfortable with the idea of FTL. And there are people who, I mean, I think the idea of time travel is pretty absurd. And I'm not a big fan of time travel stories, though I know it kind of works as a convention. But a lot of people assume that time travel will somehow be a thing at some time because they've read so many stories that convincingly represent time travel as a practical technology.
Yeah, similarly with living in a simulation. I mean, the idea that we could be living in a simulation, which I don't take seriously for a moment, I hasten to add, but the idea that we could be living in a simulation is one I first came across in an article by Hans Moravec in one of these issues of Extropy that I was talking about. And it seemed a very outre idea at the time, and it's certainly not one that would be easy to explain to normal people who don't read science fiction. And yet, when the Matrix films came out, suddenly everybody understood it, because we had a visual and sensory vocabulary to imagine it.
Speaking of living in a simulation, the simulation we're living in has reached the end of the hour. So it's time to end our conversation, but we really thank you, Ken, for joining us, and hope you'll come back sometime.
Thank you, John. It's really an honor to be on your show, and I do hope we can have another go at this sometime.
Absolutely.
And meanwhile, live long and prosper and all that.
Yeah. When will the novel that you're working on now, do you have a projected release date for that?
No. The reason, the reason is because a personal circumstance that delayed the well, to be blunt about it, year before last, my wife died, and
I'm really sorry about that. We were aware of that.
Yeah, just when I was about to start writing, basically, and that delayed. Although I thought I could keep on writing, it turned out that I couldn't. So my editor and publisher have been very understanding about this, and have said, send us your first draft when it's ready, and don't worry about the deadline. There isn't one anymore. So assuming that it's accepted and that I get it in the next month or two, it's possible it'll come out this year, but probably not.
Well, we look forward to reading your next novel
and talking to you about it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks. Good night.
You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.